Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream HVI podcast, and also hello to Godless Engineer. There's a YouTube channel because we're streaming over there as well. And tonight we're going. Also, I'm joined by Aaron Adair, of course. And tonight we're going to be discussing what would change our minds. Like, okay, I'm currently of the persuasion that there was a historical Jesus, and John Gleason, Godless Engineer, and Aaron Adair are of the persuasion that there probably was not a historical Jesus. And so we're going to be having a conversation tonight. We're going to having a chat about what would convince me of the opposite, and what would potentially convince them of the opposite. So with that being said, John Gleason and Dr. Aaron Adair, thank you both for joining me tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Thank you both for joining me. And I think I'll start off with this question, and then y'all can ask me the opposite question. So, what would convince you to, if y'all had to think of something, what would convince you to that there was probably a historical Jesus?
Aaron, I'll let you go first.
Okay. I'm thinking there's like two hypothetical routes going down. One is discovering new evidence and reinterpreting current evidence, because I could imagine, hey, maybe we get super lucky and we find some particularly ancient document talking about Christianity and Jesus. Maybe among the scrolls at Herculaneum, we uncover a lost letter of Paul, and he talks about meeting Mary, Jesus' mother. I'd be like, okay, wow, that is very hard to explain on mythicism, and would be an absolutely amazing find if true. But obviously, I think the chances of us finding new evidence of that level of quality are really low. So I'm just now saying, what about the current evidence we have? Is there some way of using the current evidence to come to a different conclusion than I do right now, which I think is more likely where any debate is going to happen in the next 100 years.
Sure.
Again, unless we get stupidly lucky. I want to get lucky, but I can't bet on it. So a couple of things I can imagine. So one is that I generally don't think we can extract historical information from the Gospels about the historical Jesus. But I could imagine techniques being developed and verified to show, hey, here are the limitations of what even complete fiction can do, and what residues still remain that we might be able to then apply to the Gospels and say, here is the historical residue, and it points to there being a Jesus. So I could imagine a technique like that developing. I don't know how to do it. I don't know if it's possible, but imagining if it were to happen, I could see that being used to create harder evidence for the historical Jesus that would convince me.
Yeah, so I guess where I kind of stand right now is that the evidence is vague as far as, like, if we take a look at what Paul says in his epistles and everything, and kind of along the same lines of what Aaron said here, if we could find new evidence that would definitively point in the direction of historicity, I'd be more than willing to accept that. I think that currently the language that is used in the evidence that we have is vague enough to where it's ambiguous. Like we just can't make a solid determination. But I am persuaded by the arguments, for mythicism. So I think that you would need some kind of information or some kind of argument that could clearly demonstrate that there were Christians either prior to Paul or congruent with Paul that knew of an earthly Jesus, like knew of his ministry and all that other stuff. But as I said, right now, the earliest evidence we have is Paul, and he doesn't talk about Jesus as if he walked on earth. At least if you examine the Greek and the Greek words that he used and how they're generally used in that culture, I think that it points in the direction of mythicism. Another thing that you have to overcome is the rank Raglan hero type. Putting Jesus in that class is kind of really detrimental for the historicist point of view. Also the connection to mystery cults. So, like, I feel like the only way to actually sway and push me in a direction is to find new evidence that clearly points away from mythicism.
That actually also reminds me that from the debate, one of the issues I was highlighting was the virtually immediate divinization of Jesus in the Pauline literature, and it goes even beyond the apotheosis of Julius Caesar, because Caesar becomes a god and goes to heaven, but I don't know of any examples of divinization where the person is said to have been pre-existent and the creator of the universe. Caesar gets to go to heaven and hang out with the Olympians. He doesn't get to take Zeus's throne. That's kind of weird. If we could find, though, exemplars of that kind of fast and highly theologically amazing examples of divinization, that would also help me say, hey, here's a model how this could work, and also help me see that there are fewer problems with the historical Jesus model as I see it.
That is an interesting point, Aaron. I see what you're saying there. I don't think I quite looked at it like that before. But I see what you're saying. But I guess I'll explain what I suppose what would convince me. I would like, if again, I agree that we're probably not going to get new evidence, and if we do, that would be amazing. I hope one day we get new evidence, regardless of what it says. I hope we do.
Mm-hmm.
We have so little. I concede. And really, sometimes there would be a debate about, okay, is this text earlier or later, or even is this piece of that text earlier or later, and that can get really complicated and very technical. But setting all of that aside, I guess what I'm having a hard time seeing at present is, okay, so Paul talks about that Jesus was crucified. Now I'm open to, okay, maybe there was a crucifixion in a celestial realm, and I know that there are some that would look at examples like Inanna's death, how she was taken into the underworld, and she was put up on a stake or something like that. She was hanged, excuse me, and she was killed, and stuff like that, and then rose. She was going down the underworld to rescue Dumazy because he was down there. So John, did you want to say something?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering if you can acknowledge that it takes on this whole that Paul says that Jesus was crucified thing. It takes some extra extrapolation on what Paul says in order to place Jesus on earth, because he never directly says like the Romans did it, and he never directly says that the Jews are responsible or anything. Of course, I side with what seems to be the more majority of scholars out there that take Thessalonians to be interpolated, and so not indicative that Paul considered the Jews to be responsible for Jesus's death. Don't you think that there's a bit of you have to do a bit of extrapolation on the information in order to get to the Romans crucified Jesus in the archons of this Aeon section?
Yeah, I suppose so, because yes, assuming that 1 Thessalonians 2:14-16 is an interpolation, regardless of that, does Paul ever state that the Romans crucified Jesus directly? No, he does not. So yes, I do agree with that point. It's an assumption that he was talking about Romans.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree.
Would you agree then? Considering in, I forget the passage in Corinthians, I think Aaron probably knows, where Paul talks about being taken up into the third heaven and seeing Eden and all that. Sorry, go ahead, Aaron.
That was 2 Corinthians 12, if memory serves.
Yeah. That he like taken up to the third heaven where he saw Eden. And then separately in the apocalypse of Moses, or the life of Adam and Eve, we also have Adam, Eve, and I believe Seth all being buried in the third heaven. So it seems like at least that deaths can occur in heaven and burials can occur in heaven. So do you agree that that's part of first century Jewish Christian theology, is my question.
Well, what I will say is I am not sure if they all believed that. I will say that, yes, that is present in the first century. Sure.
Okay. Because I mean, I feel like what both Aaron and I, as well as like Carrie or Lataster, we're making a modal argument, like a probabilistic argument about what, you know, Jewish Christians in the first century would have thought, like making a calculated hypothesis about their theology when we don't have a full picture of their theology. So I know that a lot of times it's construed as, well, we know they thought these things, but I feel like our actual argument is that the probability that they had this kind of theology is highly likely. And so that you would need some kind of counter evidence to affect that high likelihood that it was a theology that was at least dominant enough to make it into very prominent scripture that was being used by Jewish Christians in the first century. Like, and I'm talking about that in contrast to like some of the more, you know, the not so dominant ones, like the weird sex cult that Bart Ehrman talks about in Lost Christianities, maybe, or one of his other books, the weird Christian sex cult. I'm talking about in contrast to like the lesser known sort of Christianities that were in existence at that time.
I think we should actually be careful to talk about theology singular, because there is no one theology amongst Christians,
Right.
amongst Jews. What's the saying? 2 rabbis, 3 opinions?
No, yeah, I definitely didn't mean to make it out to be like it was a unified kind of thing. So thanks for that, Aaron. It's definitely. I was just trying to point out that it's a probabilistic argument about what a theology was, and that it would be easy for them to have this theology, considering the literature that we do have access to.
And that's kind of why John, that's kind of why I responded the way I did. That while I don't see all Jews or Jewish Christians, whatever you want to call them, believing that in the first century, I do concede that it is present in the first century. That's why I put it in that way, to Aaron's point.
Okay. Sorry, I know that I interrupted like your statements. So
that's okay. I get it.
Yeah,
that's okay. Don't worry about it. I kind of finished what I was trying to say anyway. So now I want to ask you about your thoughts on Hebrews. Like whenever you do bring it up, what kind of argument are you exactly making when you use Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews?
Well, for me, I'm stating that Hebrews was a very prominent text to the first century Jewish Christians, and that the community that produced Hebrews was either within Paul's group, or it was just adjacent to it. So like it's very closely related to like Paul's theology, so closely related that, you know, it's even debated in you know, the centuries after it was written, that Paul wrote it. So like it's very similar, like in theology, maybe not necessarily in style, obviously, but in theology, it's very similar. And considering that this was a first century group, I feel like it's definitely a representation of what some first century Jews would have thought. And I think that its proximity, like in theology, its proximity to Paul's group means that we can make an educated guess about how this theology factored into Paul's theology and whether or not Paul held to this theology. I don't think that there's anything in Paul's theology that actually contradicts what Hebrews was teaching about Jesus and Christianity.
Oh, so when I heard you say that, okay, I get what you're saying there. So I guess my question would be is, because I guess this is the part that I'm not quite understanding, is that in Hebrews it talks about the duplication theology. What's in heaven is also on earth. So Jesus is in heaven, he's also on earth. Where do you see something like that at all occurring in Paul's letters? Do you see any hints of that where Paul is hinting to this?
Well, I think, though, there's one thing is that the duplication theology you're mentioning, that's not really what the theology is. It's not that everything that exists in heaven is identically
Okay.
on earth. It's that the lower realms are... This is coming ultimately from Platonic philosophy. So you first have the
Sure.
highest forms in like the mind of God. Then you have the demiurge that does a crappy job making copies of that. And then basically you duplicate that kind of thought with the different levels of heaven. So you get less and less and less perfect copies of the same sorts of things. But it's not that everything in heaven is identical to that that's on earth, especially if we're made of this crude stuff. Otherwise, then if that were the case, if Jesus were always in heaven and always on earth, then why did he have to come down? The whole
Sure.
idea is that Jesus only originally existed, either according to Paul in the Philippians hymn that he comes down from heaven, or in the Ascension of Isaiah that we love talking about and debating. Either way, it has Jesus coming down from heaven or through the heavens to do whatever he needed to do and then return to the heavens. That wouldn't have been necessary if he existed in all of those places at once. So I think that's a point of the duplication theology that needs to be clarified.
Okay. Yeah, and oh, go ahead, John.
Oh, I was just gonna say that's the reason why, like, the copies that are on Earth have to be cleansed with blood because they're imperfect, right? And so that's what Hebrews explains, is that, you know, they got to be cleansed with blood, and then as you get far higher and higher up into heaven, I think Hebrews uses a very generic sort of like, you know, objects like the temple or whatnot, but you get more and more perfect copies to where you don't need, you know, those kinds of sacrifices and everything. So, like, don't mistake it as being like, you know, sort of like mirror realms, you know, that exist. Like,
Yeah.
you know, that like there's things that are happening on earth, and at the exact same time there are things happening in the first layer of heaven, second layer, all the way up to the seventh. It's just that the objects that are here on earth are duplicated up in heaven. Like the types of objects and everything like that are duplicated up, but they're just more perfect the higher you get up in the levels of heaven.
Got it.
And maybe the best example of that is when it comes to the heavenly temple versus the temple on earth. That Moses was supposed to have been revealed what the temple is, and then because he saw the heavenly temple, he was then inspired to give instructions to build a copy here on earth. But most importantly, when the temple was destroyed here on earth, it didn't destroy the one in heaven. And people have been just trying to recreate the perfect temple that was originally revealed to Moses. So that's kind of that idea that we're trying to mimic, that's probably the best term, mimic what's in the heavens and doing a crummy job of it, especially because us mere mortals can't even see the heavens without divine assistance.
So now what I want to ask you both about is, what does the Philippians hymn, like, which deities would you compare that to? Like in the hymn where it talks about that Jesus was in heaven, he descended from heaven, and he took the form of a man. That's what the hymn says. He became a man. What exact myths do you both recall is that reminiscent to exactly?
What
Most
myths?
immediately, like the first thing, like you actually mentioned it a bit earlier, the descent of Inanna into the underworld.
Yeah.
That's the first idea that comes to mind, though to what extent that myth would have been known in detail in the first century is really hard to know.
Yeah, that would be difficult.
But it seems like the idea of things happening on the edge of the upper and lower heavens we see in Plutarch when he discusses the myth of Isis and Osiris, and he talks about the suffering of Osiris is actually taking place at that liminal space between the upper air and the lower heavens. And then he also says that the other passions of the gods are actually encoding the same sort of mythology. It's not exactly the same as like going up and down through the heavens, but at least has that concept of here's this intermediary acting and suffering in that intermediate space for the sake of the transmission of knowledge, salvation, etc.
And I guess I come at this a little bit different in that I guess I feel like what you're asking, Jacob, is that you want to know what myths exist prior to Christianity where Jesus is like, or the Savior is manufactured or generated in some kind of way, and so it's like some kind of like celestial version of the Savior that's doing those things. My question though is that considering in the Philippians part, considering the actual words that are used, like if you look at the Greek words, it literally means like to make or to manufacture, like him in the likeness of men, right? Considering I'm sorry, I can't remember right now. Philippians is one of the authentic letters, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I thought so. I just didn't want to misspeak. So, like,
No problem.
when Paul is talking about this, we're talking about a man who literally believes that a resurrected dead Jew has appeared to him and revealed the truths of God, and it changed his life and everything like that. My question to you, Jacob, is why should we take this person as referring to being made in the likeness of men or being born or anything like that to be just a normal way you and I would talk about being born? Like, I feel like there's this presumption on the historicist part that every time they talk about being made or being born, it's taken in a very normalized sense that we have now, as opposed to removing our understanding of like our colloquial words that we use, like being born and all that. Why is it that historicists can't try to put themselves in the shoes of a first century Jew who thinks that a resurrected dead Jew has appeared to them and revealed the truths of God? Like, comparatively to the other beliefs that Paul seems to hold, God manufacturing the body of the Savior that he is sending to save the human race, against the forces of evil. At what point are you like, yeah, that's totally normal shit? Like, at what point are you like, oh, he just means a normal kind of birth? Because it seems to me like you should remove any kind of preconceived bias about what he's talking about and try to actually interpret Paul in the time frame and the theology that he seems to be working in.
That's a good question. So how I'll respond is I will concede right away. It is not normal. No, it's not. I don't think it is. The only exception to that is I would say that maybe in Galatians, when Paul says he was born of a woman, is a little different. But setting that aside, I do agree that it's not normal what Paul is saying there, because he's suggesting that Jesus is a bit more than some random person that was born. There's something more special about it. I agree with that. That's what he's saying. He's putting a lot more emphasis on the birth of Jesus. Now, then the question would be is, can one assume it was earthly at all, or is it entirely heavenly? And the way I'll respond to that is I'm going to come back to the ascension of Isaiah, because even though I don't agree with y'all about the ascension of Isaiah right now, I do find it interesting nonetheless that I know that comparisons have been drawn between the ascension of Isaiah and Inanna's ascent. Now, Aaron did say earlier that the connection between Inanna and the ascension of Isaiah and or early Christianity isn't clear because it's not known how well known it was in the first century. But I do find that comparison very interesting, even though I'm not yet convinced that there was an earlier form of the ascension of Isaiah that has no hint of an earthly Jesus at all. I do find the argument interesting regarding comparing Inanna's descent to the ascension of Isaiah. As I can see the connection there, is what I'm saying, without necessarily bringing up that there was a early ascension of Isaiah that lacked any hint of an earthly Jesus. So I get that, but to come back to John's question more directly, because I do find that somewhat related. But to come back to John's question more directly, I will say, given how Paul is portraying the creation of Jesus, I can see how it is ambiguous and not clear if he meant earthly or not. Because in Philippians, he does say he became a man. He came down like a man, in the likeness of a man, or however you want to put it. So I get that. So I guess what I'm stuck on is why. How do you both look at Paul saying that Jesus was born of a woman then in Galatians? You go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I'll let Aaron go here in a second, but I think it's rather curious that you're so willing to allow this one verse go, but then you stick to the born of a woman thing, because, I mean, I don't know if you recall, but they both use the exact same word, like made in the likeness of men. It's genomai. And when Paul in Galatians 4:4, it's also genomai. So like they're both the same word. That he never uses genao, which is more indicative of like a normal human birth. He never uses that for Jesus. So like between the two verses, it seems like you're selectively choosing which one you want to take as being like ambiguous, and the other one seems to be not ambiguous to you, which I'll mind you, Galatians 4:4 does match a particular phrase that's used in the Old Testament, but Paul notably used a different construction of the phrase. Because in the Old Testament, it's at least in the Septuagint, that we can directly compare, I believe it's genao of a woman as opposed to genomai of a woman, and Paul uses genomai specifically directly in the face of what the Old Testament says and how the Old Testament describes like that phrase. So it seems a little odd to me to selectively choose one verse over the other. I don't know of any context on the Galatians 4:4 that seems to indicate that it was actually born of a woman, because Galatians 4:4 is actually part of a larger crap. The word's escaping me. COVID sucks. A larger allegory. Yeah, it's a larger allegory about it. Anyways, sorry, Aaron, you go ahead. I don't mean to.
Well, actually, you teed up exactly what I was going to highlight, is that starting in Galatians 3 and throughout the rest of Galatians 4, Paul is setting up this analogy, allegory of the
Abraham and
women
Sarah,
of Abraham.
like
Yes. Yeah. So Sarah and
Okay.
Hagar, and basically that Sarah is supposed to be the mother of promise, the person that basically you want to be the mother of, and Hagar is basically if you were born under, the flesh and the word, you're worldly and you're stuck with the law and things like that. And so the whole point I see of what Paul is saying here when he says born of woman, born under the law, being born under the law is specifically being born under the motherhood of Hagar, and basically being the mother of the slave woman. But because Jesus took on that slave law mentality and then was killed, is the reason then he can become our root of salvation and become the children of Sarah, become children of the promise, as the rest of that allegory goes through. So I just put it in that context and say, this is probably what Paul is getting at. Because on the other hand, if Paul is trying to give us some biographical information, Jesus was born of a woman. Who talks like that? If you're going to say, born of Mary, born of Jessica, what have you, why would you leave it as vague as possible unless you're making it part of this larger analogy about these women that Paul's already set up before and continues afterwards? So that's how I slot that verse.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
When it comes to documents, I think maybe an interesting thing we can ask each other is, assuming we're stuck with the books we have,
Sure.
what I'm trying to imagine, like asking myself, asking John, what book from the New Testament is most likely going to show there's a historical Jesus behind it? Like, which source gives you think the biggest headache towards mythicism?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess what I'm stuck on right now, and I'm open to, as I've said, I'm open to the other way around, is crucifixion. And I've said this before, is there an example, is there an exact example anywhere, like prior to Paul's letters, where anybody was crucified anywhere but earth, like maybe in hell, the firmament, or heaven? Is there any examples that y'all can think of right now?
Well, so it depends on what you mean by crucified, because I feel like what
Okay.
a lot of time historicists strictly mean Roman crucifixion, which is not indicative of the vast swath of crucifixion representations in history, because crucifixion quite literally just means affixed to some kind of piece of wood, like a pole. Romans, of course, had the whole cross thing, but like if you look at a critical examination of the history of crucifixion and that kind of torture and torture and execution method, you'll find that it ranges between just basic impalement to the very specific Roman crucifixion, and even some of the more the weirder versions of crucifixion, like the upside down crucifixion or the crucifixion on like an X kind of thing. So it really kind of depends on what you mean by that, because if you're talking about crucifixion in the historical context, like in the ancient context of what we understand that execution method to be, then the descent of Inanna matches up with what you're asking for, because she was hung up after being killed down in the underworld. She was hung there for 3 days or whatever, and then she was resurrected. And so I mean that's one.
Right.
But I don't think that we don't need a pre-existent like crucifixion to happen in the celestial world in order for Christians to come up with this theology, because I feel like adhering to that means that, the Christians could have never made anything up. Like I feel like you have to assume that they just simply didn't make anything up. Like there was no ingenuity in the theology of Christianity, when if you look at it, all mystery faiths, all mystery cults, they applied ingenuity to syncretize Hellenistic ideas with the religion that they were looking to syncretize things with. So, I mean, I feel like you have to assume that they couldn't have imagined any kind of new information, which I think is counter to like what we understand about like human ingenuity, as well as how mystery faiths and mystery cults were developed. And so I guess I just don't understand the hard pressed nature of your query here, because it seems like unless there's a pre-existent like crucifixion that happens in history that's taught by some other random cult out there, then it's most likely just that's not what happened. Like, I guess I just don't understand that logic. I don't know. What do you think, Aaron?
So a few things I'll go. So one, you already mentioned Anana basically being hung up on a nail, which is in spirit the same sort of thing as crucifixion, because often one of the things you do, and it's even in the Torah law, is that the executed person, you put them up on a stick basically to show and say, you better be good or else. Inanna's basically doing the same thing. She's killed and then hung up in order to shame her. So there's that aspect that's, of course, very ancient. There is a seal stamp that we have. It's an image of Dionysus tied to an anchor that also seems to show some sort of like suffering. We don't really know the details. We don't have a narrative that explains things, but it's Dionysus tied up to an anchor in cross form. So it's an interesting exemplar, though it's hard to know how much to extract from that. I had mentioned in the debate that Osiris is also killed in heaven. In the Egyptian myth, he is chopped up by his brother, or is it stepbrother? I forget exactly the genealogy, especially in Egyptian genealogy. It makes Game of Thrones look simple. But he's chopped up by Seth and killed there. So a different form of being killed isn't really that far apart. Ultimately, but the one thing I do understand what you're getting at, Jacob, is, hey, when people talk about crucifixions, every crucifixion we know about is here on Earth. And I do see then why that would imply this would be more of the same. But let me give you the counterexample that shows that once we throw in the context of godmen, it kind of messes things up. In the myth of Adonis, the way he is killed is he's basically accidentally gored by a boar. And we would say, well, we know boars exist here on Earth. That's where things normally happen. So this must have been something that historically happened in the past. But this is total mythology. And Adonis, his name almost certainly comes from the Semitic Adon, Lord. So it clearly comes from a mythical source. And even though this story is kind of sort of placed on Earth, we don't think because people are normally gored by boars, this person must have been some historical event in the past that's just gotten a little bit messed up along the way. It's mythology all the way down in that case. So I see where your intuition is, but I think there are counterexamples to that once you put it in the context of godmen.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and then on top of that, you do have a lot of parallels between Adonis and Dumazy, in which many scholars have suggested that Adonis's myths are borrowed from the stories of Dumazy on top of what you said. So I see your point.
Yep.
I see. I think the next thing I'll ask you both is: do you see parallels between Jesus and the Enochic literature, 1 and 2 Enoch?
I mean, I guess. Oh, go ahead, Aaron.
I was going to say there's definitely influence, but sometimes it's hard to tell exactly. So, not to mention, there's also some weird textual variants out there. For example, there's an addition to 2nd Enoch where it's Melchizedek who's basically given a virgin birth, like a magical birth story. It's just kind of tacked on some manuscripts of 2nd Enoch. And you look at that and you just think, how'd that get there? And if this wasn't Melchizedek, you would think this is just one more Greco-Roman myth. The fact it's much more similar to those sorts of stories, and yet it's here in this allegedly super Jewish document, which again shows that whole border between Jewish and pagan is ridiculous. But there's also, of course, the layerings of heaven, which we see in Paul's writing and other Christian literature. So it has a similar cosmos. And I guess the big thing is like the character of Enoch, especially in the most later versions of the Enoch story, where basically he becomes the little Yahweh. I think that's in 3rd Enoch. He gets that kind of title.
Right. The lesser Yahweh. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Sounds like
if
a
Jesus
rapper
is
name.
more like that.
I'm little Yahweh.
Well, I think it goes Yahweh, Lil Wayne, little Yahweh. All right. That's my best joke for the night. But yeah, that might be the best analog if we're saying that the original Jesus is this super angel, and he's more like the Metatron than he is like the Carpenter.
Yeah, yeah, I get what you're saying, because like you strip away all the stuff, and you're not sure about you strip away all the miracles, take all the miracles out of there, and you're not sure about what's left, and you work your way down to Jesus crucified. Yeah, I get what you're saying, and somebody could do the same thing with Adonis. Adonis was killed by a boar. The end.
Yeah, or
Just
even worse, what is it? Addis bled to death castrating himself. Balls exist on Earth, but that does not show that Adonis or Addis existed and invented castration.
It reminds me of Oregon of Alexandria. I think he did that to himself in front of his classmates.
Yeah, at least allegedly. I don't know what the
Yeah,
the quality of the evidence is, but that's definitely
Sure.
one of his less
that's the
savory
story
stories.
about him. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was basically he was reading this and he says, I need to be balls to the wall for Jesus, and he took that a little far.
Yeah, I think he was reading. I think it goes, if I remember correctly, he was reading some passages in the New Testament about.
Making oneself a eunuch for the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Jesus spoke favorably of the of eunuchs in one of the Gospels, so makes sense.
Yeah. That's in Matthew, if I'm not mistaken. And because I recently wrote about this, we have some comment on that by Marcion that says, there's no way Jesus said this, because if you guys actually believe what Jesus said here, you'd all have done this by now, and clearly you haven't. So, for what I could tell, Marcion was the first educated Bible literalist.
Mm. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the another verse in the Gospels. I think it's in the Gospels where it says, gouging out your eyes. If you gouge out your eyes, and yet you will still see. And it's sad, but some people actually do that every now and then. Not many, but one person every once in a while. We hear a story where somebody they think they're hearing a voice in their head or something like that, and they do it. They take it out, and they think they still see, but they don't.
Well, all we can say is, kids, don't try that at home.
Right. Don't do that.
Okay. If I can return to something I was bringing up, I want to maybe do like side by side of which documents in the New Testament we think might be the hardest to explain on our thing. So, like, what's the hardest thing for a mythicist to explain in the New Testament, and what book is the hardest to explain for the historist? I think that might be an interesting exercise. So, John, I'll make you go first.
Okay. Sorry, explain that to me one more time.
Yeah. So, like, which book in the New Testament do you think is hardest to explain on mythicism?
The hardest to explain.
Or if you prefer, which one do you think is most likely to indicate a historical Jesus? Whichever you think of that is easier to answer.
Right. I mean, honestly, I can't remember. I don't know why it's not popping into my head. Normally, I would have verses right there at my fingertips. It's the verse with the archons of this aeon in it, where it talks about who crucified Jesus. I can't recall where that is in Paul's letters. I've got it written down. Like, I've written it down so many times.
9, but my memory is really bad on that.
Yeah, I think it's somewhere in 1 Corinthians.
Yeah, that one. I think that one is the most ambiguous of them, because it's like we don't know what who are the archons that he's talking about. And what we have to do is we have to look at how Paul is talking, or how Paul uses this archons of this aeon, or archons in general. Like, who is he referring to? So we kind of have to build, I guess, maybe a little bit more complicated of a theology based on other verses outside of that, in order to attempt to understand what he could mean by that. And So I think that one's the most difficult, just because I feel like it's the most ambiguous of all the verses that I've seen.
Well, I guess for me is there are two things that come to mind right away. It would be either John, the Gospel of John, or Revelation as being really difficult, Revelation especially, for being really difficult for historicists to explain. That okay? Well, you have Jesus, and I would say that the author of John's Gospel is building off of the Philippians hymn, especially when you look at the way it begins about Jesus manifesting in the flesh. The Word is manifesting in the flesh. So it's like it's capitalizing off of the Philippians hymn, and then making it even more clear that Jesus was a pre-existent being. And it kind of reminds me of the way Philo talks about the logos, Philo's logos, or the word of God manifesting in flesh, being I think he says something about being provided a human body somewhere, or there's some kind of hint to it. I don't remember though. I'll just stop right there about Philo. But anyway, it kind of reminds me of the way Philo talks about the logos, and so in John's Gospel, if Jesus is descending from heaven down, he's the Word coming down and manifesting in the flesh. You can't really say that in John's Gospel. It's saying that he was born. Now somewhere, I think it's in chapter 3 or chapter 6. Can't remember off the top of my head. I think it's in chapter 6. It does make a brief mention that he was that Joseph was his father, or probably supposed to be his father. He's probably lifting that from Luke, because Luke says that. Luke's version of that verse is contrary to Matthew and Mark, because in Matthew and Mark it says, "Is this not his mother Mary?" Or in Matthew's, that's in Matthew's version, "Is this not his mother Mary?" Or in Mark's, is he not the son of Mary? Or is this not something like that? So as Luke's changing
son of
it,
the carpenter,
right? So Luke's replacing Mary in that verse with Joseph, and John does the same thing because he knows Luke. So yeah, I would have a hard time explaining John chapter 1 with the way he's manifesting in flesh. So there, I would have to assume that after Jesus was deified, I guess, or quasi-deified, because he's supposed to be the Son of God. He's not supposed to be a deity himself. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So he's like, okay, well, if he was born, how is he the Word manifesting in flesh? And then, of course, contradicts the infancy narratives, which, of course, historicists that are not believers would dismiss the infancy narratives, as I dismiss the infancy narratives. We don't believe in the infancy narratives, of course not. So, yeah, I would say John chapter 1 is very difficult to explain. I'll stop there.
Okay. All right. So I would say probably the place that I would most likely trip over historical Jesus stuff would probably be in the Gospel of Mark. It's going to probably have the most opportunities to have a residue from a historical figure. So again, if we can find a way of saying what can't be just invention in Mark, then that's probably the place that's going to most likely undo mythicism for me. That along with more argumentation maybe about Paul's letters. So that, there are some like little asides in Mark that make me wonder to what degree is he saying things because this was like the folklore of the time, like mentioning like who carried the cross for Jesus and things like that. Little details that I know Carrier has like a way of trying to explain it, but it still makes me think, you know what, I do have to be a bit cautious about what else could be explaining this same bit of data. So things like that could, turn me around. But I do have to note, Jacob, you got me a little bit excited when you said that Revelation might be an interesting one as well, because I submitted an abstract proposal for the next Society of Biblical Literature meeting to the Revelation section, where I'm going to try to say
Awesome.
interpreting the book of Revelation without the historical Jesus or in spite of the historical Jesus. So we'll see if that goes through.
Awesome. Can't wait to read it.
Well, like I say, I'll first see if I can even present it in the first place, or if they tell me to go home.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm a little confused by Jacob's answer here, just because of, with John and Revelation being written like in the 2nd century. I guess I know for me it's easy to just write them off as being made up. Like I feel like it's harder to explain. I guess the historicity progression like earlier rather than later, because it seems like you can easily write off like the Revelation and the Gospel of John as being something that's just totally devoid of any kind of like historical connection like to a Jesus, just because of the time frame that they were written in, let alone the fact that they don't have any kind of sources like attached to them, really, at least nothing that we can actually verify. So I guess maybe that's what's got me confused, but I don't know, maybe I just haven't thought about it enough.
So let me see here. We got a little bit of time left. So what's the next thing y'all want to talk about?
I mean, if so, I brought up my notes from our review that we did.
Sure.
And I have to say that it's rather odd, like going back and watching like your review of like the debate with both Dadpool and Brother Garfield.
Okay.
Because both Dadpool and Garfield make wildly inaccurate claims.
So what did they mention? Wait a minute. John's breaking up.
Okay, I wasn't sure if that was me or not.
No, I see you clearly and hear you.
Okay. John, I think I know what's going on. John, you have been making fun of Elon Musk online, and he's clearly trying to cut off your internet.
Okay, we can
Am
see
I back
you now.
yet?
Yeah.
Yes.
I got
you're so you were bringing up some things that Garfield and Dadpool were saying. I wasn't able to capture the rest of it due to the breakup.
Sorry, my computer had it.
No problem.
So my stuff. So like for let me see. I'm trying to look at the my notes here.
No problem.
Well, I remember
because I remember Garfield. Yeah, go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, so for example, Garfield was adamant that Paul over and over again says "brothers in the Lord" as a disproof of our reading about Galatians 1:19, and John and I both checked, and it's like the number of times that Paul in his authentic letters says "brothers in Christ" is 0, and the fact that like Garfield was adamant that he has done that hundreds of times and that somehow undid our reading is just the sorts of things that make us say, okay, why can't critiquers of mythicism, at least do a level of fact checking that they claim that we are supposed to have been doing? I know we're taking a fringe position, and I accept that, and I also means I try to hold it lightly rather than tightly. But when the defense against it is just based on things that are just so demonstrably wrong or missing the point, it makes it look like either some folks are just not paying attention or they're effectively doing their own sort of apologetic, and it just becomes weird that we encounter that in this area, even amongst atheists. It's surprising, actually.
So my response to that would be, when he said that, I'm not sure if I misunderstood what he said there or if I misheard something, but no, I don't think I would. Yeah, I do not agree with what Garfield said there. The way I would look at it is, the way I recall myself looking at it is I was looking at the brother of the Lord in Galatians 1:19. I wasn't focusing on brothers in Christ or in other passages that Garfield was talking about. So I guess maybe I got thrown off there or something.
I mean, I guess the argument that I heard Garfield make was that brother of the Lord or brothers of the Lord could not be a reference to Christians in general, because Paul only ever said brothers in Christ when he's referring to fellow Christians, which is just not true. He, at least in the authentic letters of Paul, he never uses brothers of Christ. He uses brothers, sisters, that kind of language, and then the couple of times he says brother of the Lord. But like, I really don't understand Garfield's point there, in that brother of the Lord, like like Lord would be a cultic title for a divine being, and considering the theology of Paul's family of God, it kind of seems like he's talking about Jesus there, like talking about Jesus in the divine sense rather than in a blood relation sense, so a fictive kinship. And so it kind of caught me off guard, like something so wrong there. And then there was a comment by Kip Davis that got brought up, where Kip was trying to make some kind of distinction about whenever Paul calls fellow Christians brother, it's vocative and everything like that. Like he was trying to make some kind of distinction with the brother of the Lord. But like upon inspection, like if you go to an interlinear Bible where it has like what kind of constructions are being used, it always has like the genitive and not necessarily only the vocative. So like there's literally no distinction to be made there. It was very pointless to bring that up, because I think Garfield brought up something by Kip, and then maybe there was another comment in the stream by Kip. Yeah.
There was a comment and then another comment. So there was a comment in the original debate that Kip left, and then there was a comment when Jacob and Garfield were discussing. No, take that back. No, I saw the comment. I think it was in another live stream with Derek on Mythvision. That's where I caught it, and I took the screen capture, where something must have gotten lost in translation, because when Kip was talking about when Paul uses the vocative, that somehow indicates that he only in those cases is he talking about fellow Christians, and it's just grammatical nonsense, and I really don't understand what he might have been trying to get at. There might be a part of the discussion missing because the chat doesn't necessarily show everything that was there. Messages get deleted in that, but nonetheless, I looked at that and I'm just like, this looks like throwing spaghetti at the wall. This is not careful philological arguing, so I really do not know what he was going at there.
Yeah, and I mean that same context was brought up in the review you did with Garfield. Garfield called out a comment from Kip during y'all's review, and I remember that one specifically because apparently Kip said that I regurgitate Carrier's argument better than Carrier does himself, apparently. So that struck me as weird, but yeah, so like the rule that Kip is bringing up just simply doesn't exist in Greek. At least I couldn't find any. I talked to Carrier about it. He didn't know of any. And but more than that, more than asking like experts and all that, like the actual data that's in Paul's letters show that Kip is just wrong on this position. So yeah, I guess I wanted to bring those couple of things up there about the discussions.
Well, to come back to what I was saying earlier about Galatians 1:19, I get what y'all's position is, that Paul is not literally saying that James is the Lord's brother. It's more of a spiritual title. I'm open to being convinced. I'm at present not convinced. That's what's going on there. Because the way I look at it, the way I look at it currently is that the way Paul's saying it there is he's trying to distinguish James from, say, other people he mentions in Galatians, like Peter or Cephas, what you want to call him, and others. Because like when you look in 1 Corinthians, for instance, when Paul seems to get upset, and I think he's getting upset. And he's talking about other rival leaders that he doesn't like. There are those who are of I think it goes something like this. There are those of Apollos, there's those of Cephas, and there's of Christ, or those of Paul. And so he's going on this, what I think is a little rant about other rival leaders in the movement. And in Galatians, he calls James the Lord's brother, doesn't call other people in the letter the Lord's brother, I guess is the point that I'm making. And that's one of the reasons why.
Well,
I mean, go ahead, Aaron.
Well, in one place he actually does. So there's two places where Paul uses the phrase brother of the Lord or brothers of the Lord. And in that second case, I think it's in 1 Corinthians 7, but I can't remember exactly if I'm citing it right. But Paul is talking about like who basically gets travel stipends, or not, that's not the exact right words, but basically getting support from the churches to help as they're traveling around doing missionary work and allowing their women or their wives to come along with them. And in that argument, Paul mentions or uses the phrase brothers of the Lord. But since Paul is trying to argue that, hey, the apostles get to bring these along, and even okay, so Paul is trying to argue that he should be getting this right, and his fellow companion, who's not an apostle but a helper for him, should also get this right. The examples that Paul gives are apostles, Peter, and the brothers of the Lord. He wouldn't be bringing up brothers of the Lord if it was some special high status for his argument, because he was saying that'd be like me going up and saying, hey, the president gets to sleep in the White House, why don't I get to? Well, it's because I'm not the president. If I instead I said, hey, even this bum gets to get a free room in this hotel, why can't I? That would be a more persuasive kind of argument. And that's the point that seems to be going on there with Paul's argument. He's saying, hey, even brothers of the Lord get this perk, so why don't I and my fellow companion? So that's an example of him seeming to use brothers of the Lord as a category of regular Christians, in this case, doing missionary work.
And so that's 1 Corinthians 9:5 is where this takes place at, for anybody listening. And I would love for somebody to explain to me the Greek in this section, especially if you want to take brothers of the Lord to mean a blood relative, because like when so the full verse is, do we not have the right to be accompanied by a believing wife, as do the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas. The word used for believing wife there, that phrase, is actually the same root word for brothers. Like it's the adelphos, but in the feminine, and so it's very clearly in the first half of the sentence to be referring to a fellow Christian woman, but in the second half of the sentence, it's supposed to refer to a blood relative of Jesus. Like, I guess I'm very confused by this selective definition game that's being played here, because I don't see any context here that would cause us to like switch, the context of adelphos that's being used. So I mean, that's one thing that I want people to really think about. Like, what's the explanation for 1 Corinthians 9:5 and the switching between a believing sister or a believing wife or just a fellow Christian woman and the brothers of the Lord, and how that factors into the whole title of brother of the Lord.
And like I said a moment ago, I am open to changing my mind on Paul's use of brother in Galatians 1:19. I'm going to pull up this. We have a super chat, so I'll pull this up real quick, and then after that, we'll close.
Okay.
Jesus Tales, thank you for your super chat. So this question appears to be for you, Godless Engineer. What's part of your ideas about a mythical Jesus is not in line with Carrier's theory? Being a bulldog for a scholar is not a slight.
Well, okay, so I do have to agree with my wife on one aspect of it, and that's that the very specific use of probabilities, like very specific probabilities, in that you're using numbers, makes it a bit more difficult in the argument. I understand Bayesian analysis and the need for the numbers, and why the specific numbers don't exactly matter as far as that, as long as you have good reasons for giving certain numbers, certain probabilities in your analysis. You can more easily identify like where problems arise. But I do have to agree that as a communicator, it's a lot harder to talk to somebody that doesn't understand probabilities and doesn't understand the mathematics of it. It's a lot harder to talk to them about that. It's much easier to speak in a more colloquial version of Bayesian reasoning, rather than a full-blown Bayesian analysis. So it's not that I disagree with Carrier. It's just that I have a different tactic that I find it circumvents people's problem with using numbers. And but like I said, it's not me disagreeing with Carrier's numbers or disagreeing with using Bayesian analysis. It's just a lot easier to discuss with somebody that's not like mathematically minded, the evidence and how it all factors in together.
And if I may just very quickly hop on
Sure.
things, I just will say I directly disagree with Carrier on. So, for example, Richard has tried to use the infancy narratives to actually support his reading of Jesus having to be specially generated from the sperm of David. That he tries to actually use that to enforce his reading of Romans 1:3. And I don't think his argumentation there is adequate to make his case. So that's something I don't think he's persuasive on. I don't think Carrier is right to completely skip over basically the book of Revelation as part of the argument, because I think it's something we should be accounting for on either mythicism or historicity. And the fact he skips over it, I think he means he's lost a possible source of inspiration for supporting or undermining his thesis.
All right. Well, first off, I want to thank everybody for viewing the stream and watching, and for everybody's comments. And John Gleason and Dr. Adair, thank you both for joining me tonight. I think this has been a good conversation.
It's been super.
Same.
Excellent. All right. So I'll see everybody later. Thanks.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.